Everyone laughed at the rusty old John Deere he bought. His dog found secret compartment in the engine. The auctioneer's voice was a gravelly rhythm under the blistering Texas sun, a sound as familiar to me as the lowing of my own cattle. It was the annual county equipment auction, a place where ranchers like me came to pick over the bones of failed operations or trade up for something with a little less rust and a few more years of life in it. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. Mostly I was just there to see who was selling what, a kind of barometer for the health of our community near Abilene. A man's equipment tells a story, and I've always been a keen reader. My Australian Shepherd Scout lay in the shade of my Ford F-250, his one blue eye and one brown eye tracking the crowd with an unnerving intelligence. He wasn't just a dog, he was a partner. For 8 years, he'd been my shadow, reading my moods better than my own wife, Sarah, sometimes did. He knew the difference between the whistle for a wide gather and the soft click of my tongue that meant, stay close. On a ranch that's been in your family for over a century, you learn to trust the silent language of the land, of your animals, and most of all, of a dog like Scout. His instincts were truer than any weather vane. That's when I saw it. Tucked away at the back of the lot, looking more like a candidate for a scrap heap than a working machine, was a John Deere Model B. It was from the late 40s, maybe early 50s, and time had not been kind. The iconic green paint was mostly a memory, surrendered to a deep, flaky coat of rust the color of dried blood. The tires were cracked and flat, the seat was a skeleton of springs, and a bird had made a nest in the manifold. A low chuckle rumbled beside me. It was Earl Pritchard, my neighbor to the south. His family and mine had been running cattle on adjacent spread since Texas was still finding its feet, and our relationship had always been a mix of grudging respect and simmering tension. Lately it was more tension. A long-standing, gentleman's agreement over a 100-acre parcel along Little Elm Creek was starting to fray. His herd had been pushing our fence line, and whispers of lawyers had started to poison the air at the local feed store. Thinking of getting into the museum business, Jack? Earl said, a smirk playing on his lips. His son David, a younger, harder version of his father, snorted in agreement. Just admiring the history, Earl, I said, my voice flat. I kept my eyes on the tractor. There was something about it. Not its potential, because it had none. It was something else, a feeling of solidity, of permanence. It had survived. The auctioneer finally got to it. All right, folks, lot number 247, a genuine piece of American history. A John Deere B doesn't run, but she's got good bones. Who'll start the bidding at $500? Silence. Even the cicadas seemed to pause. 300? The auctioneer pleaded. A few more snickers rippled through the crowd. I saw a couple of other ranchers shake their heads and turn away. It was junk, everyone knew it. $100, I got scrap value right here, boys. Something moved in me. Maybe it was defiance against Earl's smug face. Maybe it was a flicker of connection to my granddad, who'd sworn by these old two-cylinder machines. He used to say they had a heartbeat, a steady pop-pop-pop that you could set your watch to. 200, I said, my voice clear and steady. The auctioneer's head snapped in my direction, his eyes wide with surprise. Earl Pritchard outright laughed, a loud, barking sound that drew more eyes to me. I felt a flush of heat on my neck, but I didn't back down. I got 200 from Jack Harper. Do I hear 250? The crowd was silent again, this time with amusement. It was a fool's bid, and they were all enjoying the show. Sold! The auctioneer slammed his gavel down. To Jack Harper, for $200. Your wife's gonna love that yard ornament, Jack. I ignored the comments and walked over to pay the clerk. Hauling it home was an ordeal in itself. The old tractor groaned in protest as we winched it onto the flatbed. It smelled of rust, oil, and mouse nests. By the time I got it back to the ranch and unloaded it behind the main barn, the sun was sinking low, painting the vast Texas sky in shades of orange and bruised purple. It looked even more pathetic sitting there, a monument to a bygone era. Sarah came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She took one look at it, then at me, and just shook her head with a weary smile. What in the world are you going to do with that, Jack? I'm not sure yet, I admitted. Felt like the right thing to do. She didn't press. She knew me well enough to know that sometimes my reasons weren't things I could easily put into words. That night, Scout started acting strange. Usually, he'd curl up on his rug by the back door after supper, but tonight he stood at the screen whining. His ears were perked, his body tense. "What is it, boy?" I asked, scratching behind his ears. He whined again, a low, insistent sound, and nudged the door with his nose. I figured he just needed to be let out again, so I opened it. But instead of heading for the grass, he trotted directly to the old John Deere, his tail low and stiff. He circled it once, twice, his nose twitching. Then he stopped at the front, right by the engine block, and let out a single, sharp bark. I watched him from the porch, a knot of confusion tightening in my gut. He barked again, then started pawing at the rusty grill, his claws making a scratching sound on the old metal. "Scout, leave it," I called out. He ignored me, which was unusual. He whined, a high, anxious sound, and looked back at me, his mismatched eyes pleading. Then he went back to pawing at the engine. I'd seen him act this way before, but only when he'd cornered a rattlesnake or found a newborn calf tangled in a fence. It was his "something is wrong" behavior, his "you need to see this" alert. I sighed and pulled on my boots. The air was cooling, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. I walked over to the tractor, the grass cool and damp under my feet. "What's got you so worked up, buddy?" Scout didn't stop. He pushed his nose right up against the side of the engine casing, sniffing intently along a seam just below the flywheel cover. He let out a low growl, not of aggression, but of frustration. He was trying to tell me something, and I was too thick to understand. I ran my hand over the rusted metal where he was focused. It felt solid, just a thick plate of cast iron, coated in decades of grime and rust. I couldn't see or feel anything unusual. "It's just an old engine, boy. Nothing in there but rust and spiders." He backed up, looked me straight in the eye, and barked again, a full-throated command this time. Then he went right back to pawing at that same spot. A shiver went down my spine that had nothing to do with the evening chill. Over the years, I'd learned one thing above all else. You don't ignore Scout. You just don't. His instincts had saved my hide more than once, from a charging bull I hadn't seen to a washed-out crossing at the creek during a flash flood. My neighbors could laugh all they wanted at my $200 piece of junk, but my dog was telling me it was something more. And in my world, a dog's word carried more weight than a man's ridicule. The next morning, the tractor was the first thing on my mind. Scout had slept fitfully, getting up twice in the night to stand at the door and whine toward the barn. I drank my coffee black on the porch, watching the sun burn the morning mist off the pastures. The ranch was quiet, save for the distant complaint of a few heifers. It was a peace I was fighting to protect. The banknotes were piling up, a consequence of 2 years of drought followed by a fall in cattle prices. The dispute with Earl Pritchard over that creek pasture wasn't helping. That parcel had the most reliable water on either of our properties, and losing access to it would be a crippling blow. My pride and my family's legacy were tied up in every acre of this land. Putting my mug down, I whistled for Scout. He came trotting, his tail giving a hopeful thump against my leg. "All right, boy," I said. "Let's go see what's got you in such a state." We walked back to the John Deere. It looked just as useless in the clear morning light. I'd brought a few tools with me, a heavy-duty wire brush, a crowbar, and a hammer. Scout immediately went to his spot, nudging the engine block with his nose as if to say, "Here, look here." I started with the wire brush, scraping away the thick flakes of rust. A cloud of red-brown dust filled the air, smelling of earth and decay. Underneath, the metal was pitted and dark. I kept working, the rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape the only sound besides Scout's quiet panting. After about 20 minutes of hard scrubbing, I started to see it. It wasn't a natural seam from the casting process. It was a fine, almost invisible line, a perfect rectangle about the size of a shoebox lid, cut into the thick metal of the block. Someone had gone to an incredible amount of trouble to hide it. The edges were so perfectly flush that only the complete removal of the rust revealed the hairline crack. My heart started to beat a little faster. I took the tip of the crowbar and tried to find purchase in the seam. It wouldn't budge. I tapped along the edges with the hammer, listening for a change in tone. Near one corner I heard a dull thud instead of a metallic ring. I focused my efforts there, gently but firmly tapping and prying. Suddenly, with a groan of tortured metal, a small section gave way. I wedged the crowbar in deeper and pulled. Rust and dirt showered down as a heavy iron plate, cunningly designed to look like part of the engine casing, swung open on a hidden interior hinge. My breath caught in my throat. Scout pushed his head forward, whining with excitement. Inside the dark cavity was not a stash of tools or a bottle of whiskey, but a tightly wrapped object. It was a pouch, made of old, dark leather, bound with a rawhide cord that had gone stiff with age. It was surprisingly heavy. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted it out. It was dry and brittle, and the leather felt as fragile as old paper. I carried it over to the tailgate of my truck with Scout trotting anxiously at my heels. I set it down carefully and worked at the knot in the rawhide. It crumbled under the pressure, and the pouch fell open. The contents were not what I expected. There was no glint of gold, no precious jewels. Instead, there was a small stack of papers, yellowed and folded, so delicate I was afraid they'd turn to dust in my hands. On top of them was a single tarnished silver dollar from 1863. I picked up the first folded paper and carefully opened it. It was a hand-drawn map, sketched in faded brown ink on what looked like oilcloth to protect it from moisture. I recognized the landmarks instantly. There was Little Elm Creek snaking its way through the property. There was the cluster of old live oaks we called the Seven Sisters. And there, marked with a strange eye-like symbol, was the old, derelict windmill in the west pasture. But the property lines on this map were different. They extended further south, well past the creek, encompassing the very land Earl Pritchard was now claiming. The next document was a letter, the handwriting a looping, elegant script from a time when people took care with their words. The ink was faded, but I could make out the date at the top. May 12th, 1864. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was signed, Jedediah Harper, my great-grandfather, the man who had first staked his claim on this land. The letter was addressed to his son Thomas, my grandfather. He wrote of troubled times, of raiders and uncertainty sweeping across Texas during the Civil War. He mentioned selling a herd of longhorns for gold coin, and his fear that it would be stolen before it could be used to secure the family's future. I have established a family trust, he wrote, not on paper in some distant bank, but in the soil that will feed our children's children. I have secreted it away where only a Harper with a true eye can find it. The Iron Sentinel watches over it. Follow the brand of the watchful eye. This map is the key. This land is the vault. A family trust, a hidden cache, a map. It was the stuff of childhood stories, but I was holding the proof in my hands. Scout rested his head on my knee, letting out a soft sigh, as if he knew the weight of what we'd just uncovered. The laughter of my neighbors at the auction seemed a lifetime ago. This rusty old tractor wasn't a joke. It was a time capsule. And my great-grandfather had just reached across a century and a half to hand me a mystery that was inextricably tied to the very survival of our ranch. The discovery of the leather pouch changed everything. The daily rhythm of ranch life, checking fences, rotating pastures, monitoring the stock tanks, suddenly felt charged with a new, secret purpose. Every ride across the land became an act of investigation. I carried the brittle map, now carefully encased in a plastic sleeve, in my saddlebag. Scout seemed to sense the shift in me. He stuck closer than ever, his intelligent eyes constantly scanning the landscape, then looking back at me as if to confirm we were on the same hunt. I started with the map. Spreading it out on the old oak table in my office, I compared it to modern survey maps of the property. The landmarks were mostly the same, the creek, the draws, the high points, but the scale was approximate, and the symbols were cryptic. The Iron Sentinel was the most prominent marker, located in what was now our far west pasture. It was drawn next to that strange symbol, the one Jedediah had called the brand of the watchful eye. It looked like a circle with a dot in the middle, enclosed by a lazy H, our family's brand. My first trip was out to the west pasture. It's a rugged piece of land, mostly left for summer grazing, dotted with mesquite and prickly pear. The old air motor windmill stood on a low rise, its blades long seized by rust, its wooden ladder rotted away. It hadn't pumped water in my lifetime. It was a lonely, creaking monument to the past, the Iron Sentinel indeed. Scout ran ahead, his paws stirring up puffs of dry red dust. He circled the windmill's concrete base, sniffing and whining, the same way he'd behaved around the tractor. He was telling me this was the place. I examined the base, running my hands over the rough, sun-baked concrete. I searched for any sign of the Watchful Eye brand, but found nothing but cracks and weather erosion. It felt like a dead end. Disappointment settled in my stomach like a cold stone. Jedediah's clue was either too clever, or time had erased it completely. My next stop was town. I needed more information, a broader context. I started at the Callahan County Courthouse, a grand old limestone building that smelled of floor wax and old paper. I spent 2 days buried in the archives, pulling dusty plat books and deed records. I found Jedediah Harper's original land grant from 1858, and there it was, in black and white. On a map drawn by the first county surveyor, the southern boundary of the Harper Ranch was clearly marked 100 yards south of Little Elm Creek. It included the entire bend in the creek, the very pasture Earl Pritchard was claiming. I paid for a certified copy, a surge of vindication running through me. This was ammunition, solid proof. But it didn't solve the bigger mystery of the trust. While in town, I decided to visit Walter Abernathy. Walter was 87 years old and had lived in the area his whole life. His mind was as sharp as a newly honed skinning knife, and he held the unofficial history of every family in the county. I found him on his porch shelling peas into a metal bowl. "Jack Harper," he said, squinting at me over his glasses. "You look like you're carrying a heavy load. It ain't just the price of beef, is it?" I sat down in the rocking chair opposite him and told him about the property line dispute with Earl. I didn't mention the tractor or the map. I wasn't ready to share that part of the story with anyone. Walter spat a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby can. "The Pritchards always were a grasping bunch. Their great-granddaddy and yours, they never did see eye to eye. Something about a cattle deal gone sour during the war." My ears perked up. "What do you know about that time, Walter? About Jedediah?" He rocked slowly, his eyes distant. "Not much. Just stories my own granddad told me. Said Jedediah was a smart man. Canny. The war years were chaos out here. You had army patrols, vigilantes, and out-and-out bandits roaming around. A man with anything of value had to be clever to hold on to it. Heard a story once that Jedediah hid his family's savings somewhere on the ranch. Buried it, they said, to keep it safe from Quantrill's raiders, who were known to sweep through this part of Texas. Quantrill's raiders. The name sent a chill down my spine. They were notoriously brutal. It made sense that Jedediah would go to extreme lengths to protect his family's future. "Did you ever hear what happened to it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Walter shook his head. "Nope. Most folks figured it was just a legend. A good story to tell around a campfire. If there ever was any gold, it's long gone or buried so deep God himself couldn't find it." I left Walter's place with more questions than answers, but with a growing conviction that the legend was real. The story of a feud with the Pritchards, the mention of bandits, it all lined up with the tone of Jedediah's letter. He wasn't just hiding money. He was protecting his legacy from a world that had gone mad. Back at the ranch, I turned my attention to the other clues. The brand of the watchful eye. It bothered me. A brand is meant to be burned into hide or wood. I spent an afternoon in the old tack room, a place layered with the smells of leather, horse sweat, and saddle soap. In the back, covered in dust and cobwebs, was a crate of old branding irons, some of them not used since my grandfather's time. I pulled them out one by one, their symbols representing generations of Harper cattle. And then I found it. At the very bottom of the crate was an iron unlike the others. It wasn't our simple, lazy H. It was heavier, more ornate. It was the I symbol from the map, a perfect circle with a dot in the center, held within the familiar H. I'd never seen it before. No one had used it in living memory. Holding it felt like holding a key. But what did it unlock? The next day I saddled up my horse, Rio, and with Scout trotting alongside, I decided to ride the disputed fence line again, this time with new eyes. The tension with Earl was getting worse. I'd seen his truck parked near the boundary several times, and I knew he was just waiting for me to make a move. The legal papers I'd found were a powerful weapon, but I wanted to understand the whole story before I fired that shot. We followed the winding path of Little Elm Creek. It was low this time of year, the water moving sluggishly over smooth stones. On the bank stood a grove of ancient cottonwood trees, their thick, gnarled trunks a testament to their age. One, in particular, was massive, a giant of a tree that must have been a sapling when Jedediah first arrived. Scout, who was usually busy chasing rabbits or sniffing out coyote trails, suddenly veered off and began barking at the base of this giant cottonwood. It was the same insistent, commanding bark he'd used at the tractor and the windmill. "What is it now, boy?" I said, dismounting. He was scratching at a section of the trunk where the bark had peeled away, revealing a hollowed-out scar in the wood about chest-high. It looked like an old lightning strike. I ran my hand over the smooth, weathered wood inside the hollow. My fingers brushed against something that wasn't wood, it was leather. My heart leaped into my throat. I reached deeper into the dark recess and pulled out a small leather-bound journal. It was stiff and warped from years of heat and humidity, but it was intact. The cover was unmarked. I carefully opened it. The first page read, in that same elegant script from the letter, "The Journal of Jedediah Harper, 1864. I sank to the ground, my back against the ancient tree, and began to read. Scout lay down beside me, his head on my boots as if he knew this was a solemn moment. The journal was a window into the past, a first-hand account of the struggles and fears of the man who started it all. He wrote about the lawlessness, his distrust of the local authorities, and his feud with Silas Pritchard, Earl's great-grandfather, whom he accused of being a Confederate sympathizer who used the war as an excuse to seize his neighbor's land. And then I found the entry I was looking for. June 3, 1864. I have finished my work. The family trust is secure beneath the iron sentinel. Silas Pritchard grows bolder, and I fear he suspects I have hard currency. He will not find it. I have sealed the entrance and marked it not with a sign that can be weathered away by sun or rain, but with the brand of the watchful eye, burned into a foundation that will outlast us all. The brand is the key. Only a Harper will know where to find the iron, and only a man who trusts the land will know where to look. I have moved the tractor, the new John Deere, into the old barn. Its engine compartment is a fine hiding place for the map and my letter. No one would think to look inside the guts of a machine. I read that last sentence twice. The tractor. He didn't mean my tractor, the one from the auction. He meant his tractor. But how? The pieces clicked into place with a deafening clang. My grandfather must have known about the secret. Maybe he even told my father. And when the time came, they would have passed the secret on. But my father died young, in a rodeo accident when I was just a boy. The secret died with him. The old tractor must have been sold off in an estate sale years ago, its hidden cargo forgotten. It had been out in the world, passing from owner to owner for decades, its secret waiting patiently inside. My buying it at the auction wasn't a coincidence. It was fate. It was a piece of our family history coming home, guided by something I couldn't explain. A clap of thunder in the distance startled me. A dark wall of clouds was building on the western horizon, the kind of summer storm that could turn the prairie into a sea of mud in minutes. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the cottonwood above me. A new urgency seized me. The journal had given me the final piece of the puzzle. The brand wasn't a symbol carved into the concrete. It was an actual brand, an indentation made by the hot iron itself. I hadn't seen it because I had been looking for a drawing, not a scar. Just then I heard the rumble of a diesel engine. Earl Pritchard's pickup truck came bouncing over the pasture, stopping a few yards away. He got out, his face a thundercloud that matched the sky. "Harper, I see you're admiring my trees," he called out, his voice laced with venom. I stood up slowly, tucking the journal safely inside my vest. "These trees are on my land, Earl, and I've got the papers to prove it." He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You can have all the forged papers you want. My family has grazed this land for 100 years. A judge will see it my way." He gestured toward the fence line. "I'm having a new survey done next week. After that, my lawyers will be in touch. Enjoy the view while you can." He got back in his truck and sped off, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. The storm was coming, both literally and figuratively. The time for quiet investigation was over. I had to get to the windmill. I had to find what Jedediah had hidden before another storm, one of lawyers and lawsuits, broke over my family and washed away everything we'd ever worked for. With the wind whipping at my hat and the first fat drops of rain beginning to fall, I swung back onto Rio's saddle. Scout, sensing the change, was already racing ahead, leading the way toward the Iron Sentinel. The final act was about to begin. The ride to the west pasture was a race against the storm. The sky had turned a sickly shade of bruised gray, and the wind howled like a hungry predator, tearing at my clothes and flattening the tall prairie grass. Distant lightning spiderwebbed across the horizon, followed by the low, guttural rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath Rio's hooves. My horse was skittish, his ears twitching, but he trusted me. And I trusted Scout, who ran ahead with a relentless, focused energy, a black and white blur against the darkening landscape. We reached the rise where the Iron Sentinel stood just as the first sheets of rain began to fall. The old windmill moaned and creaked in the gale, its rusted tail vane swinging wildly back and forth. It looked less like a sentinel and more like a ghost, haunting the land it once served. The rain came down harder, cold and stinging, plastering my hair to my forehead and soaking my denim jacket in seconds. Scout didn't hesitate. He ran straight to the windmill's concrete base, to the same spot he'd identified before, and began digging frantically at the muddy ground beside it, barking into the wind. I dismounted and tethered Rio to a sturdy mesquite, grabbing the branding iron and a small sledgehammer from my saddlebag. The air was electric, thick with the smell of rain and ozone. I knelt beside my dog, shielding my eyes from the downpour. Wiping the mud and water from the concrete slab, I looked again, this time knowing what to search for. My fingers traced the rough surface, feeling for an indentation, a scar left by hot iron a century and a half ago. And then I found it. It was faint, eroded by countless seasons of sun and ice, but it was unmistakable. A slight depression in the concrete, in the exact shape of the watchful eye. It was located on a separate square section of the slab that I now realized was a cleverly disguised capstone. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the roar of the storm. Jedediah's words echoed in my mind. "I have sealed the entrance, marked it not with a sign that can be weathered away, but with the brand." He hadn't carved it. He had seared its impression into the concrete while it was still wet, a permanent, subtle marker that only someone holding the iron itself could verify. Using the edge of the sledgehammer as a chisel, I began striking the seam around the capstone. The rain was relentless, running in rivulets down my arms and face, but I barely noticed. Each strike was a blow against the years of silence, against the looming foreclosure, against Earl Pritchard's arrogance. Scout stood back, barking encouragement, his coat slick and dark with rain. Finally, with a loud crack, the seal broke. I jammed the branding iron's handle into the crack and heaved with all my might. The heavy concrete square lifted, revealing not a cellar but a thick wooden trapdoor set flush with the foundation below. It had a rusted iron ring for a handle. It took all my strength to pull it open. The wood groaned in protest, swollen with years of dampness, but the hinges held. As it swung open, A rush of cool, musty air rose from the darkness below, a scent of deep earth and things long forgotten. I pulled a powerful flashlight from my saddlebag and shined it into the opening. A set of steep, stone steps led down into a small, rock-lined cellar. It was perfectly dry, a testament to my great-grandfather's careful construction. Taking a deep breath, I started down, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the absolute blackness. Scout whined from above, but he didn't follow. This was my part of the journey to finish. The cellar was no bigger than a small pantry. The air was still and cold. Spiderwebs thick as cotton hung from the ceiling, but otherwise it was clean. And in the center of the dirt floor sat a small, iron-banded chest, about the size of a footlocker. It was covered in a fine layer of dust, but otherwise seemed untouched by time. I knelt before it, my hands shaking. The lock had long since rusted away. I pried the lid open with my fingers. It lifted with a soft creak. I aimed my flashlight inside. My breath hitched. It wasn't a pirate's treasure chest overflowing with riches, but it was something far more profound. Neatly stacked inside were rows of gold coins. I picked one up. It was heavy, with a satisfying weight in my palm. A $20 double eagle minted in 1862. There had to be hundreds of them. Enough to pay off the bank, buy new equipment, and secure the ranch for my son should he ever want it. Enough to finally breathe again. But beneath the coins, there was more. Tucked in an oilcloth wrap were more papers. I carefully lifted them out. The first was a bill of sale for a herd of cattle, dated 1864, detailing the very transaction that had funded this hoard. And beneath that was the document that made my world stand still. It was the original hand-signed deed for the Harper Ranch, granted by the state of Texas. Attached to it was a detailed survey map, drawn and notarized by the county's first official surveyor. It laid out the boundaries in painstaking detail with landmarks, measurements, and signatures, and the southern boundary line was exactly as it had been on Jedediah's hand-drawn map, well south of Little Elm Creek, encompassing every square inch of the land the Pritchards were trying to claim. This wasn't just a copy like the one I'd found at the courthouse. This was the original foundational document of our family's existence here. The gold would save our finances. This deed would save our land. Jedediah hadn't just hidden his wealth. He'd hidden the proof of his legacy. I climbed out of the cellar, my heart full to bursting. The worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind a steady, gentle rain. Scout greeted me with a flurry of licks and happy whines, his job complete. I closed the trap door, slid the heavy concrete capstone back into place, and stood up, looking out over my family's land. The rain was washing the dust from the air, and the world smelled clean and new. The confrontation with Earl didn't happen in a field with shouting and accusations. That wasn't my way. The next evening, after a long talk with Sarah where I laid everything out on the kitchen table, the map, the journal, a single gold coin, and the original deed, I called him. "Earl," I said, my voice calm, "I've got something you need to see. Can you come over?" He was hesitant, suspicious, but he agreed. He arrived 20 minutes later, his son David in tow. They walked into my kitchen with the defensive posture of men ready for a fight. I had them sit at the table. Sarah quietly placed 3 cups of coffee before them, then stood by the counter, her arms crossed, a silent pillar of support. I didn't say a word. I simply slid the original 1858 deed and the notarized survey map across the table. Earl picked it up, his rough fingers tracing the old, elegant script. He read it, then read it again. David leaned over his shoulder, his own expression shifting from smugness to disbelief. The silence in the room was thick and heavy, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. "Where did you get this?" Earl finally asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It's been in the family," I said simply. I wasn't going to tell him about the gold or the secret cellar. That was a Harper family matter. The land was what stood between us. "It's the original grant, Earl. It seems our families have been mistaken about that boundary for a long, long time." He stared at the paper, at the undeniable proof in his hands. I saw a century of pride and stubbornness warring in his eyes. He looked at the map, at the creek, at the clear, unwavering line drawn by a man long dead. He could fight it. He could spend thousands on lawyers, dragging us both through the mud for years. Or he could accept the truth. He finally looked up at me, and for the first time, I didn't see an adversary. I just saw an old rancher, a man tied to the same piece of earth I was. He looked tired. My granddad always told me that Creek Bend was ours, and he said, his voice quiet. He told me his father told him, and my great-grandfather left this to prove otherwise. I replied gently. It's not about who's right or wrong anymore, Earl. It's about what the truth is. He slowly pushed the deed back across the table. He stood up, and for a moment I thought he might storm out. Instead, he just nodded his head once, a short, sharp gesture of defeat. All right, Jack, he said. All right. David looked like he wanted to argue, but a hard look from his father silenced him. They walked out without another word. As I watched their truck's taillights disappear down my long driveway, I felt no sense of victory, only a profound sense of relief. A wound that had festered between our families for generations had finally been cleansed. The land was safe. The legacy was secure. The weeks that followed were a quiet revolution. I paid off the bank loan in full, the teller's eyes widening when I explained I'd sold off some old family investments. I bought a new baler and a newer, more reliable truck. The whispers in town about the Harpers being in financial trouble died down, replaced by a grudging respect. The story of the old deed got out, as stories do in a small town, and the boundary dispute was settled for good. Earl Pritchard, true to his word, pulled his herd back to his side of the creek, and the fence line was restored to its rightful place. We weren't friends, not yet, but a measure of peace had settled between our ranches. One cool Saturday afternoon, I finally turned my attention back to the rusty John Deere. It still sat behind the barn, a silent witness to the whole affair. I spent the day tinkering with it, cleaning the carburetor, flushing the old fuel, putting on a new set of tires. It was a debt of gratitude I felt I owed the old machine. By late afternoon, I had it running. With a cough of black smoke and a sputter, the two-cylinder engine caught, settling into that iconic, rhythmic pop-pop-pop my granddad used to talk about. It was a heartbeat, the sound of survival. Sarah came out and watched me drive it in a slow, triumphant circle around the yard, Scout trotting proudly alongside, his tail held high. "You're not actually going to use that thing, are you?" she asked, laughing. "No," I said, shutting off the engine and letting the sudden silence settle over us. "I'm going to put it in the front pasture right by the gate. A reminder. A reminder that the past is never truly gone, that it's buried just beneath the surface, in the soil, in the guts of an old machine, waiting for someone to listen. A reminder that sometimes the most valuable things aren't shiny or new, but old and rusted and full of secrets." That evening, as the sun set over the plains, I sat on the porch steps with a cold beer in my hand. Scout came and rested his heavy head on my knee, his mismatched eyes looking up at me with a deep, knowing calm. I scratched him behind the ears, my gaze drifting across the rolling pastures that stretched out before me. This land wasn't just dirt and grass, it was a living history, a tapestry woven with the sweat, fears, and hopes of my ancestors. Jedediah's trust wasn't just the gold coins buried beneath the windmill. It was the land itself, and the responsibility to care for it, to honor it, and to pass it on. I looked over at the John Deere, its silhouette dark against the fading light. Everyone had laughed, but my dog knew better. He knew that some treasures aren't meant for the eyes, but for the heart. He had sensed a story that needed to be told, a secret that needed to be unearthed. He hadn't just found a hidden compartment in an engine, he had found the key to our survival, the proof of our legacy. In the vast, quiet expanse of the American West, I had been reminded of a profound truth. A man's greatest assets will always be his land, his history, and a loyal dog who knows how to listen to the ghosts.